Good evening, everyone. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the International Decade for People of African Descent Assembly Guyana and IDPADA-G Talks African History Public Month. Sorry. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the International Decade for People of African Descent Assembly Guyana and Talks African History Month Public Lecture Series. I am your moderator, Kizike Peters. The International Decade for People of African Descent Assembly Guyana and continues to promote recognition, justice, and development for people of African descent in Guyana through public education, advocacy, and cultural initiatives. Today, many post-colonial societies continue to confront economic dependency, social inequality, and cultural fragmentation. While political independence has been achieved in many countries, the deeper questions remain: who controls national resources, whose values shape the state, and how can unity be fostered in societies marked by historical division? These are the concerns raised by Kwame Nkrumah in his seminal work, Conscientism, Philosophy and Ideology for Decolonization. Nkrumah argued that African societies are shaped by traditional colonialism, Islamic influences, and Euro-Christian ideas introduced through colonialism, created ideological tension after emancipation and independence. He proposed conscientism as a unifying socialist framework rooted in Africa's communal traditions. And Nkrumah warns that political independence without economic control leads to neocolonialism and maintains that true liberation requires economic transformation, social equality, and pan-African unity. It encourages critical reflection on the lasting effects of enslavement, colonialism, and structural inequality in contemporary society. In light of this, the ideas of conscientism, philosophy, and ideology for decolonization by Kwame Nkrumah remain relevant to Guyana today, especially amid rapid qualitative economic growth. Nkrumah's warnings about colonialism, economic inequality, and social division resonate with current debates, foreign control of resources, unequal distribution of wealth, and ethnic fragmentation. This call for economic transformation, social justice, and national unity offers a framework for thinking about inclusion and equitable development in modern day. To guide us through this discussion is Andrew Hicks, who was born and raised in South Georgetown and brings to his work a lifelong commitment to community development and social transformation. A trained sociologist and educator, he has more than 20 years of experience teaching at the tertiary level, specializing in criminology, social policy, gender studies, and conflict resolution. He has studied at the University of Guyana, the University of the West Indies, the United Nations University for Peace, and is a graduate fellow of the Center for Addiction and Mental Health at the University of Toronto. He has also received advanced training in fiscal transfer design and public policy management. And is a former head of the Department of Sociology and Assistant Dean in the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Guyana. His scholarship addresses crime, multicultural politics, migration, and peace building in plural societies. Beyond academia, he is a long-standing grassroots advocate through community activism began in his youth in Albrighton, Charleston, and led to the National Service. His National Service as a member of Parliament in Guyana's 6th Parliament. We are pleased to welcome Mr. Andrew Hicks as the presenter for tonight's discussion. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Well, first of all, thank you very much, Kizzy, for IDPADA-G for the opportunity to hear in this evening's conversation on the writings of African the African scholar Kwame Nkrumah, who wrote the book Conscientism, first published in 1964 and later revised in 1970. This book is considered as one of the seminal pieces of Nkrumah. It is really an analytical sketch of Western political thought. Its central thesis is that Africa needs to evolve its own ideology and philosophy to solve the crisis of the African conscience. For Nkrumah, this crisis afflicted the African society, by extension, the African continent, through a loss of identity that has emerged due to the fact that there are three competing cultural currents across the globe, the continent of Africa, but more specifically in the land of his birth, the Ghanaian society. And he contextualized these as the traditional Africa, the Euro-Christian Africa, and the Islamic Africa, each having their own tenets and at the same time competing with each other. And as a result of that, there is an African marginalization of Afrocentricity. What Nkrumah believed really is that rather than facilitating the competition of these currents, these ideological pillars, that it is better to synthesize, to work towards the synthesization of these pillars so that you can find commonality and thus engender the spirit and the praxis of coexistence. For Nkrumah, these three legacies manifest as a challenge across the post-colonial Africa. And I want to say that while Nkrumah is given lots of, and quite rightly is given a lot of credit for promoting and popularizing the importance of African unity, he was not the first to acknowledge that that there is a disunity that engendered across Africa as a result of its colonial experiences. In fact, Blyden of Ethiopia, in his writings titled Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race, also advocated that an African civilization should have its own validity as part of the broader civilization process, to realize the characterization of communal African life. Blyden argued essentially in his writing that Africanism is about community that is characterized of cooperation, mutual aid, and a communion that resonates with nature and the ideas of God. Nkrumah, in his revised publication of Conscientism in 1970, restated what I would call his own denial that class conflict manifested itself in the pre-colonial Africa. When Africa was conceived and believed to be free societies, uncolonized, he took the position that there was no class conflict, which is a very contested point of view. And I think he subsequently acknowledged that he may have erred in his analysis at that time. In a subsequent piece of literature, because he acknowledged that in the traditional pre-colonial African life, that you had tribal hierarchies, and those hierarchies in themselves manifested power and power-based conflict. And if one were to recognize that in the construct and the evolution of the village system across Africa, we can recognize that what preceded the village system was really the clan system. And so a village was really an amalgamation of clans. And in some ways, those villages evolved out of conquer and conquest. And so I think it is reasonable to argue that there was conflict, but at the same time, it is important to recognize that that conflict did not lead to the marginalization of the African reality, but rather it served to consolidate African life, African ingenuity, African interest, and the spirit of communal obedience. And so I want to say that in essence, conscientism for Nkrumah reflects an agenda for reconciliation. It reflects an agenda that is also intended to fuse diverse sociocultural groups or interests into a common system within the larger population set. And so you can have a unified society. And when you look deep into the analysis of the writings of Nkrumah in this context, you recognize that what conscientism was points us to is the idea of consociationalism, a system of shared governance, a system of shared leadership. And to take us away from this sort of monolithical construct, recognizing the value of diversity and plurality, and allowing for different groups to manifest their identities, but at the same time, utilize their strengths to cooperate among each other and therefore build a strong, unified, and resilient society, and by extension, continent. And I think that is what Nkrumah really advocated essentially in his construct of conscientism. Nkrumah's emphasis emphasized on this kind of alliance. And obviously, he considered socialism as an essential ideology in fusing Africanism. In fact, when you do the analysis of in Nkrumah's work, you recognize that he speaks about socialism, but he sees socialism not in the context in which it is discussed and debated today. He sees socialism as having sort of indigenous construct within the African way of life, and that African socialism is not a socialism that was subject to colonialism, but it was subject to Africans' diversity and plurality, in which you have equity and cooperation. And so Nkrumah would argue, he later on shifted to what became popularized by him as scientific socialism. And the reason that he moved from this sort of African socialism is because he said this African societies haven't gone through, having been captured by colonization, required some kind of a revolutionary undertaking in order to recapture what the colonial experience had displaced from African ingenuity and originality. And so therefore he saw that a kind of revolutionary orientation, thinking and action was essential. And again, if you look at his first publication in 1964, and you compare that with his revised publication in 1970, you see that the fact that in many African societies, because of the militancy and the revolution that had evolved as an attack on colonization, that he felt that that was really in response to the destruction that colonization had placed on Africans' life and African socialism. I think in that context, Nkrumah was pretty much misunderstood because the West labeled him as a Leninist Caesar, suggesting that he was a dictator and dictatorial. But what he was really arguing is that, look, you have to recapture the spirit of Africanism. And within that spirit of Africanism is the construct of African socialism, which is pure and had not been subject to the contamination that colonialism had brought, because the colonial system engendered ideas of divide and rule. And Nkrumah recognized and argued this position because he was really looking at this kind of capitalist domination by Europe. Its attempt at extracting the resources, exploiting and depriving the African people, the African continent, of their value, both economically, socially, and culturally and spiritually. And so, for Nkrumah, socialism is really a manifestation of communalism in the context of the African society and African way of life. And you're able to, by interrogating his writings, both on pre and post-colonial Africa, you're able to recognize that as an advocate, there are many African leaders who fell in love with his proposition. Of people like Julius Nyerere, who espoused the concept of Ujamaa. And that's just one example. And if you look in terms of the Pan-African movement and our Pan-African reality and Pan-Africanism within the Caribbean, you will see that contemporary leaders like, other contemporary leaders like Manley, Barrow, and Burnham adopted constructs of Nkrumah's writing. Burnham is heavily criticized for the 1980 Constitution, but in the Constitution of 1980, Burnham ensured that the Constitution addressed the whole issue of the devolution of power. So not only do you have provision for a regional system, but you also had provision for lower level tiers of leadership, all the way down to what was then known as the People's Cooperative Unit, to allow the accentuation of indigenous knowledge so that local communities, whether at the level of the village, whether at the level of the districts, our municipalities, or whether the level of our PCUs, what was then identified as the People's Cooperative Unit, that people can really come together using their own indigenous or Creole experience, Creole knowledge, their local skills, and postulate for their inclusivity and prosperity. And so Nkrumah had really significant influence, and its construct of the consociational democracy showed that what Nkrumah did is that he rejected the liberal concept of capitalist democracy, and what he wanted to advocate was a more kind of radical democracy, consociational democracy that moved away from this capitalist liberal approach of winner take all. Nkrumah was more concerned about all the interest groups that had the capacity to be part, to win seats in the parliament of the country, that they should be at the table and that they should have a say. And so consociational democracy was really a prescription for eradicating ethnic or racial conflict across plural societies, including Ghana and the plurality of the African continent, and obviously the pluralism that we see across the Caribbean. In Guyana, we are still struggling while we identify ourselves as a democracy in the context of liberal democracy. We have issues about not just the generation of wealth, but major issues about how the national patrimony is distributed. And I think Nkrumah recognized that all the ideologies talks about the creation of wealth, but they differ on how that wealth should be distributed. And clearly, for Nkrumah, liberal democracy was not the answer. You needed to have a form of consociational democracy that we may refer to as a form of radical democracy that allow for inclusion, participation, and in some ways, it provides opportunities for veto. So there are checks and balances within Nkrumah's system of governance. And for him, he was presenting a model that served as a blueprint, but at the same time made provision for relevant ideas across different societies to be adopted and to be contextualized in the context of the particular experiences of the particular society, given its diversity, right? And if you look at reflections on the writings and the advocacy of people like Walter Rodney, Rodney was concerned about the national unity government, which is about inclusivity. Burnham used a tripodic arrangement in which he saw the relevance of the private sector, the relevance of the state, and obviously the relevance of the cooperative sector. And so while we had a history that was aligned to private investment and so on. Burnham wanted to see transformation of the local economy in which there was a critical role and participation for the private sector, the state, as well as the cooperative sector, which is still relevant today. I mean, if you look at, we don't have very many success stories on the cooperative front, but there are important, some success stories that are important enough that can engender a model for development. If you look in terms of the Guyana Public Service Credit Union, if you look in terms of the Police Credit Union, the GDF Credit Union, they can actually amalgamate themselves into a commercial banking arrangement, and they can compete. And in so doing, they can offer a different kind of patrimony and developmental opportunities for members and citizens. And why do I say this? Now, you go to the commercial bank to access a loan, you have to provide equity capital. You have to contribute something. And so if you're taking a loan of $18 million and they require you to put in 10% and so put in 1.8 million. When you contribute that, but you're paying interest on 18 million. And so in fact, your equity contribution is consumed in the paper value of the loan. On the other hand, if you go to the cooperative society and you ask to borrow a loan, your savings serves as a guarantee for that loan, but it is not absorbed nor diminished. And so your economic standing within the credit union as against the commercial banking system is different, right? And then you have other support systems. For example, you have CUNA insurance that guarantees your loan repayment in event of death and these kinds of things. And it comes with a very minimal cost to the borrower as against you go to the commercial bank. So I'm stating all of this to show the relevance of Nkrumah's agenda, whether it be ideological, political, or economical. There are different ways in which you can foster diversity and inclusionary participation and development. I think we can see some relevance of this. I reference Rodney's construct of the national unity type of government, greatly emphasized on the issue of social cohesion, recognizing that you cannot live in a society that he did not want to live in a society in which there was an ethnic disparities and conflicts that were inhibitive to national development. And so he created a Ministry of Social Cohesion to deal with the whole issue of ethnic reconciliation as articulated by Nkrumah. And so Nkrumah saw that the African society was intention as a result of a combination of social and educational backwardness, right? And so again, he wanted to see a revolutionizing of the education sector in Africa. And so too was Burnham, Barrow, and Manley. And much of what Nkrumah talks about is consistent in the writings of the African-American scholar and historian Carter Woodson, who introduced the construct of miseducation. Colonial education was not preparing people for development. They were not preparing people for independent thinking, but rather for servitude. And so Nkrumah recognized that you needed to have, that it was a critical role for indigenous knowledge, and therefore importantly to correct the deficits of colonial miseducation, because the independent Africa, like the independent Caribbean, Anglophonic Caribbean, that was left with a colonial curriculum. And so you needed to revise the curriculum and make it more relevant. And so you ensured that the curriculum was indigenous and that it was aligned to articulating nation building in the construct of the community high school that now, in that context, we talk about it in the context of tech-for education, the establishment and the broadening of technical education through the Government Technical Institute, the Industrial Training Center, and these different places, including the apprentice institutes that are aligned to the Guyana Trade Corporation, the Trade School, the advancement of the Guyana School of Agriculture. And in the broader construct of the Caribbean, we used to talk about IDPADA to deal with the whole issue of regional curriculum for animal health and development and veterinary education. And so these are significant correlations that shows commonality about the synthesis that Nkrumah advocated. And so for me, Nkrumah's work is relevant and timely, and in the construct of today's experience, in terms of our own Guyana challenges that we experience, I remain a very strong advocate for consociational democracy. I think the time for power sharing is more relevant than ever, given the hydrocarbon reality of the country, that power sharing in the construct of a consociational democracy is relevant, and therefore I think it is apt that Guyana as a country return to the construct of constitutional reform and try to create adopt amendments to its constitution that would provide for greater levels of inclusivity, and therefore remove away from this liberal system of winner take all. You know, liberal democracy talks about the will of the majority, but very often we fail to recognize that even in the construct of liberal democracy, there is the recognition of minority participation. And so in that context, democracy is not only quantitative, it is also qualitative. Democracy should not be just about winner take all, but also about creating greater opportunities for those with less opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ancho. We now open the floor for questions from the audience. Dave is asking if you see any parallels between the system reference from the African continent, from the African context in there, and would his principles apply in the same way?
Thank you very much, Dave, for that question. Nkrumah struggled and has been the victim of his own advocacy. And that is because colonialism impacted widespread African marginalization. And so whilst we may not be able to recognize openly that there are manifest construct of a consociational regime in the African community, these principles are still present. And so in Nigeria, which is a federal system, you still have the chiefs, you still have regional governments, and so you have a devolution of the power structure, right? For me, I think Africa is still work in progress, and there is still lots to be learned from Nkrumah. And if you look at places like Mali, you see that there is evidence of Nkrumah's work. And so while they may not brand it as consociational, as a consociational democracy, because it is something that the West has rejected, these tenets and principles are still present. You know, we, growing up, I used to hear that when you're not doing too well in school, people will say, which school you going to, man? Timbuktu. But then as I got older, I was able to recognize that on the continent of Africa, Timbuktu was the cradle of African civilization. And Timbuktu was a repository of science and literature, astronomy, architecture. But yet we were led to believe that Timbuktu was about a poverty of theory, a poverty of knowledge. And I'm citing this to point out, and so indigenous knowledge is critical and remains essential. Now, in terms of relevance to the Caribbean, I would continue to say yes, you know. We, for the Caribbean, you know, we're still work in progress. But I think in terms of Guyana, which also in itself is work in progress, we have recognized that even though we have gone through constitutional reform time and again, the mere fact that the government of today acknowledges the need for a constitutional reform committee points to the fact that there is dissatisfaction at different levels within the society and acceptance by government that obviously there is need for the constitutional reform. And this is where indigenous knowledge and building out on our experiences become very relevant in the construct of conscientiousm.
Thank you. Would Nkrumah likely view Ghana's dependence on foreign expertise in the oil and gas industry as a necessary transitional phase or a sign of near global vulnerability?
Well, I don't think that Nkrumah would see it as, he would define it as necessary, but rather he would define it more as functional. And I think we'd want to make that distinction because surely Guyana has the paucity of expertise in the context of the hydrocarbon industry, much to the extent that Ghana had offered to support Guyana's transition into oil and gas economy in order to assist with our hydrocarbon development and management. And so I think that Nkrumah would have seen it as functional and However, he would have suggested different kind of a different approach to inclusionary management. For example, Nkrumah would suggest that, look, in Guyanese parlance, you can't put the rat to watch the cheese. And so don't go to America, uh, who is also a main architect in the exploration. You can probably go to parallel societies that has a commonality of interest. And so obviously you can rely stronger on the expertise that are available in places like Ghana and elsewhere.
How does Nkrumah's theory of social class struggle really applies to the ethnic and becoming again?
Well, Nkrumah recognized that this class is a hierarchical system. And he recognized that, look, I think philosophically, Nkrumah would say that no matter how society changed, it would not change in its entirety. There are elements of the past that will continue into the present and in the future. And it was on that basis that Nkrumah called for inclusionary, an inclusionary policy. It is in that context that he talks about an inclusive democracy, inclusive nation building, and so that the interests of all can be represented around the table. And that is where you're able to find commonality and build out unity. And in that unity, you find purpose. And obviously, you're able to engineer your developmental process with a higher level of alacrity. Yeah.
So what's a place for independence without control leads to neocolonialism? What concrete economic policies will align with this vision prevent this process?
But clearly, the principles of nationalism, Nkrumah was concerned about national ownership and national involvement. And so what neocolonialism manifests as a new form of colonization. And so Nkrumah sought to reject the recolonization of African societies. What he wanted to do is not only must there be political independence, but there must also be economic independence. I think quite recently, I think I saw somewhere in the media that President Trump had invited the president of Botswana to have a conversation on Botswana development in the White House. And that invitation was rejected. In fact, what the Botswanian president advocated, he said, no, if you are interested really, not merely in Botswanian development, but really in accessing the resources that Botswana have. And so you want to offer investment opportunities because you have investment interests. Come to the shores of Botswana and let's talk about that. He says, because, when I am in the White House, things are different, ideologically and otherwise, psychologically and otherwise. And therefore, he wanted to have that not that he rejects the conversation, he rejects where the conversation is to be held. And so he's saying, well, look, community power is necessary. And this is the kind of communal and indigenous and Africanism that Nkrumah talks about. that you must be strong enough to assert the importance of the presence of the African spirit in the African community as you enter into these negotiations, right? Because when you're at a different center of power, those things can have psychologically diminishing impact on your ability to qualitatively negotiate the interests of your people. And I think that's how I respond to that question.
So in what ways can Ghana's education system compare and promote the belief is necessary for the 20
Well, first of all, I think we have to get back into Guyanese and African history as part of our curriculum. That's one of the things that Nkrumah was concerned about, and he was talking about the fact that, look, when you go to a Western university and you're exposed to Western philosophy, you are led to believe that the cradle of civilization is Europe, when in fact, European civilization lagged behind African civilization. And so people talk about Plato and Aristotle, but they're not talking about our African philosophers. And so you need to have an education that is not Eurocentric. You need to have a curriculum that is indigenous. You need to have a curriculum that synthesizes what is local, what is regional, and of course, what is in the context of our African reality or African history, because it is a synthesis of that knowledge that will empower the mind, and engender the spirit of change.
Go ahead, Mr. Anderson.
Based on what you just said, I want to pose a question. How valid is the argument that philosophy and science has its origin in Europe, from the perspective that the science and technology is only valid in the systematization of thoughts on one hand and the laws on the other hand, as opposed to the African society, where they were thoughts, not necessarily documented and systematized, and laws that were invoked in practice, but not systematized.
But interestingly, in science in itself talks about natural laws. And sometimes when we speak about the African society having laws that were not systematized, is because we are looking for a particular type of codification, in a particular type of literature. But if you were to use the tenets of science, because science is an empirical discipline. And when we speak about empiricism, we're talking about the principles of observation, the principles of testing, and the principles of comparing. And therefore, if we rely on those tenets of science, then we are able to recognize that what is oftentimes attributed as the absence of codified laws, that in fact there were laws. And so there is science. And in the broader and more contemporary construct of what science is, people have a way of, when they think about science, they merely think about what they seem more to be thinking about is really more the methods of science than science itself, because science is really systematic knowledge. And indigenous knowledge has elements of systematization that engenders their relevance there and now.
Thank you. Dave is also asking, how would you see a model of consciousness work in the Caribbean, work in America? And would it be more economically or socially focused?
Well, I think it can be, first of all, conscientism can be adopted in the wider Caribbean. And I think there's been an attempt at that. The You know, in the history of the Caribbean, we'll find the records of attempt at the West Indian Federation. Which was really about bringing together the political and economic organization of the West Indian community into a single unit with the hope that we would have had eventually a system of federal government. And that is so because our leaders recognize that the movement of our people can foster a development within the West Indian community that was indigenous to the Caribbean. Canada applauded the effort of our regional leaders in their attempt to establish the federal system in the context of the West Indian Federation. That's when they donated that vessel, I think it's called the schooner, that was moving people across the Caribbean. And that's why we have a significant population of Eastern Caribbean nationals living in parts of the island. Similarly, you have Eastern, Northern Caribbean people living in places like Jamaica and so on. And so you see that there is that cultural matrix. And so really and truly, I see the work of people like Burnham, Barrow, the Manley and Eric Williams, among others, in their attempt to establish the West Indian Federation coincided with a lot of the ideas that have been presented. And if we had gone in that direction, if you think about the economic prospects for the Caribbean, Barbados by itself, because its population is not large enough to test the quality of its local product. Guyana's population by itself is not large enough to test the quality of its product in order to be able to penetrate markets outside of the Caribbean. Now, if we are a common region and you have a commonality in terms of nationhood, and so in this market space, you have significant numbers for the quality testing of your products and your value added. And so you become more competitive, whether it's be in Europe, North America, Asia, in terms of the quality of your exports. And that can add significantly to national income. And so economically, when you look at what our early leaders was attempting to do, it was really trying to bring relevance and bonus writings to the Caribbean. Unfortunately, because Bustamante campaigned against the federal government initiative, and Jamaica withdrew from the 10 countries that were involved, that led to Eric Williams making that very famous statement, 1 from 10 leagues north, which technically led to the collapse of the West Indian Federation. And then, of course, there's been other attempts, we've had CARIFTA, we've had free trade. But I think then CARICOM, and now we talk about the Caribbean Single Market and Economy, CSME. And you see what is holding back. Whilst CARICOM has made significant achievements in terms of in areas of functional cooperation, they're lagging behind significantly in the context of economic cooperation. There are still many countries that are unwilling to enter CSM even though they're part of CARICOM. And again, that is really the perpetuation of what Nkrumah recognizes as the post-colonial reality. The destruction that the facet of colonization has brought upon us. And so you really have to go through a whole system of re-education, educational reform to produce other forms of economic and social reform.
Thank you very much.
And reach that.
Thank you very much. We will now have a little discussion with all four presenters. We'll take a break. 5 minutes. Thank you.
Kindly hold while they transition to all of the presenters who were discussants this month will be are there, and they will form a panel to discuss the books that they presented. So they seem to be having some technical difficulties, but you kindly hold.
Welcome back. As we bring this 4-week lecture series to a close, we would like to reflect on the powerful intellectual journey we have created together. We began with Black Skin, White Mask, and Fans panel, presented by Mr. Vincent Alexander, which examined the psychological impact of colonialism and the struggle for identity and self-definition. In week 2, Dr. David Hines presented How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, which highlighted how Europe exploited Africa and which later resulted in its underdevelopment. Week 3 featured Mr. William Benjamin and his presentation of a history of the Guyanese working people, 1881 to 1905, by Walter Rodney, was centered around labor, struggle, and resistance in shaping Guyana's history. Finally, Mr. Andrew Hicks guided us through conscientism, philosophy, and ideology for decolonization by Kwame Nkrumah, which offered a philosophical framework for true independence, grounded in economic transformation and unity. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us again. And reflecting on Black skin of mass, the question is, how does Fanon's analysis of racial inferiority complexes help us understand ongoing ethnic tensions and social divisions in Guyana school, workplaces, political discourse?
Thank you very much for that heavy question. Before answering the question, however, I would like to identify with the fact that this series has been conducted during the period of Black history. And that what we have sought to do is to identify African authors and thinkers who have made a significant contribution to the whole philosophical development thought in relation to the continent, in relation to Pan-Africanism, the whole process of decolonization and the struggle for true emancipation. From that perspective, the application of Black skin, white masks has a lot to do with the psychological state that people will found themselves in, state that will be imposed by a number of factors. One factor would have been the imposition of the economic circumstances, and people are often responsive to those circumstances in big processes, as well as the very imposition of thoughts about humanity and where the Africa is located, and the way in which institutions such as Christianity sought to identify the Africans in a particular way as inferior to the Europeans, and therefore having to find their being, their identity in European thoughts and European culture. And in so doing, he recognized that that is what we have to push back against. Economic systems, European thoughts, and European institutions that sought to maintain us in a state of inferiority. Because as you might have seen from the other presenters, that really the problem became a problem on one hand of how in country things were organized to provide for colonizers who dominate and exploit. And inter-country, it was a kind of an extension of that kind of organization, where the colonizers were able to dominate and to impose themselves. And this had essentially to do with exploitation. A lot of the things that we use, like race and all of that, in some regards may be seen as veneers for exploitation. Therefore, it raises a critical question of, in this complex of ethnicity and race, whether there isn't an underlying class element that really drives all of it, using various facades and various veneers to perpetuate class domination and exploitation by a particular class over others. And an attempt, in fact, through that psychological mechanism, to create that class differentiation perpetuation, exploitation.
So how is families work relevant today?
Well, family work seeks to review, in some regards of history, where we were at, how we got to where we were at, and what was required to take us out of where we were at. I think that is the relevant, not only of family work, probably of all of the works that we have looked at to explain colonial society, explain the various elements of the society, and to explain the way in which that society was fashioned for detriment, and to see what tools are required to take us out of that morass.
Thank you.
I would like to say something about
Go ahead.
and contemporary. I think Andrew was in his presentation tonight. I think our post-colonial experience drove us in a direction where we had to juggle the creation of a state and society that reflected the unity in plurality, which drove us in a direction of privileging the nation, the collective nation, the collective state over the individual ethnic groups in the society. And I think this was not just at the level of governments, but even among so-called radicals, who in some sense pronounced the end of race. I come from a party in the Working People's Alliance that paid close attention to this, but I think at some point we thought we had achieved a level of ethnic unity in the society, and that we could go on to build this class society, class-based society, and not pay attention to this. I think the United Nations has rebuked us. They have said that while the states and they correctly so, while the states have paid attention to passing laws to deal with racial discrimination, anti-Black racism in society, that at the level of our sociology and at the level of our education, we have not done enough. Hence, the decade and now a second decade. And I think what has happened is that given the different histories of the different ethnic groups, but given the special condition of the African, because of enslavement, because of slavery, Africans were more vulnerable to this omission of dealing with the question of ethnic identity. And so 60 years after independence, we find that vulnerability has come to the fore in a condition, as Vincent said, of economic inequality, political domination by one party or the other, that in many regards, the African is now in a place in the African collective is in a place in man where identity is very low on terms of consciousness. Now, I'm not saying there is not consciousness within the African community. There is always a collective consciousness. But at the level of identity, I think the consciousness level has gone down. And I reference Andrew because I think Nkrumah was acutely aware of the danger, right?
Yes.
And hence, he was talking about an indigenous thought process, and that the institutions and the social relations of society must arise out of that. And so, therefore, putting a burden on the state to deal with the question of identity. All right. Now, he was rejected because, of course,
on Africa and the Caribbean is post-colonial imposed. The West was imposing a liberal democracy, which is at odds with the indigenous underpinnings of an alternative democracy. And so I think Fanon, black skin, white mask, is relevant today in explaining the African condition in Guyana.
Thank you, Gary.
If I can just
Go ahead.
come back a little bit.
Aye.
I think that I'm exploring the possibilities and ways in which people of African descent come out of the situation they found themselves in. And the United Nations, which they will refer to, made a very important step. I think it's important that it's not the African people themselves who make this, but the world at large. That they were the problem we face is that they are remnants, both institutional and legal remnants of the colonial system and even the pre-colonial system. And we know that the pre-colonial system, which had a lot to do with slavery, and the colonial system, which had a lot to do with exploitation, where there was a hierarchy coming out of slavery that reflected ethnicity. That hierarchy is now in the end. Created a situation where the African person found himself some years isolated, struggled for survival. Therefore, did not necessarily turn to correct, sought as an individual surviving hostile environment, and saw an adaptation of the European culture and way of life and values as the mechanism coming out of that state. Let me be very specific here. Let's take Guyana. The African Guyanese came out of slavery and got involved in that. That's an economic activity as much as it's an activity of self-reliance. The colonial system, in the interest of the sugar states and so forth, pushed back against that system, an economic effort to that. They then had to find a way out to survive. Because though the agriculture is connected, when they flooded out and volatility in the market, then where are we going? They saw stability in going to the public service. They saw stability in going to the armed forces. And they saw independence and removal from the kind of religious oppression in going into the internet. But this is now not a movement, a collective movement, so to speak. It was an individual effort. And so individualism kind of started, in some regards, to erode the collectivism people of Africa. But in a situation where they found individually some degree of stability and some degree of harmony, we have come to a situation where we are now accused of dominating a particular sector. And we have to be being called upon to give up that domination when it is objective circumstances that led us there, circumstances that were benefiting those who are now asking us to give it up. And so we have to understand how material circumstances, in some regards, shaped the psyche of the individual. And what people like Fanon seek to do is explain how we got into that state, but at the same time, explain that that state was not a state of our real identity. It was false identity as we attempted to overcome the problems we faced. And therefore, the need for us, in fact, to be able to go back to an understanding of who we really are, so we can then collectively come out of the situation. And I dare say the problem gathered today is very much an absence of that collectivism, an individual struggle, and therefore an acceptance of the ethos of individualism. It has led us to much of where we are economically and politically.
Not belaboring the point, sister, Kizzy. I just wanted to make an observation lest I be accused of falsifying our history. The Burnham Guyana alliance that led to the proclamation of the cooperative republic is a very important observation of an attempt to grapple with the indigenous knowledge and situating the state within that context of the individual knowledge and the collective, because cooperatives are about collective. But as Vincent has pointed out, our state was a post-colonial state that had to now operate within a world that was not made for them. So they were confronted with this hostile world that was against indigenous knowledge and indigenous formation. And so therefore, the cooperative state, the cooperative republic, did not take the kind of route that it was intended to take because of the hostilities of the time during the context of the Cold War, domination of foreign capital, and so forth. So I just wanted to make that observation that we did attempt at the level of the state and society to deal with the question of collectivism coming out of the what I refer to as the Burnham Guyana intervention, because when in my interview with Guyana, when he said Mr. Burnham discussed with him the republic, and they asked what kind of republic, and the Guyana said, well, why not a cooperative republic? And Burnham, they coalesced, and that is how we came to have the collective republic, a fusion of the conversation between those two consequential figures in our in our history. So I just wanted to plug that gap.
Thank you.
States are built on institutions and its legal framework. That's how states are built. The UN recognized that the problem was, as I said, around institutional relevance and legal relevance. But they went on further to identify the state as an important player, or the most important player, in redressing the existence of those relevance, creating the environment, recognition, justice, and development. The dilemma we are faced with in Guyana specific, the state, those who are in charge of the state, do not accept the argument that a particular group are most adversely affected by those remnants, and therefore need specific attention in the context of dealing with institutional problems, dealing with legal problems, creating the groundwork for equalization, but recognizing that even if you remove those obstacles, given that people are not equally positioned, then you must add equity to that process so as to provide an opportunity for real equalization. Probably a case our state does not accept they have a responsibility for internal reparative justice, even as they speak about external reparations. That is the dilemma that the African Union is faced with today in Ghana. A dilemma which does not pit them against other ethnic groups. It seeks to, in a sense, equalize them with other ethnic groups, so we collectively build this place out there.
Thank you very much, Mr. Alexander. We now turn to you, Dr. Hines. Considering Rodney's critique of European exploitation, how can Ghana ensure that profits from the oil and mining sector are reinvested to benefit local communities rather than foreign corporations?
I think I start by saying the obvious, and that is that we have to continue to advocate for a national control of our state. And sorry for belaboring the state. State is the most important institution in societies like ours. Our private sector is small, and they do not play the kind of role that they may play in Western societies. But the state is dominant here. And so therefore, we have to advocate for a national state, a state that puts the nation first, and then other considerations second. The struggle for that national state is not a struggle that is going to be isolated from forces outside of us. We look at our Caribbean today, and we look at what's happening right now in St. Kitts Nevis among regional leaders, and the Guyanese state has to contend with that. It has to contend with larger forces. So it is going to be a struggle. But since we are talking about African Guyanese, I would want to argue that if we strengthen the African Guyanese community to take its rightful and equitable place in the society, we will be strengthening the nation to fight against external domination. I think part of our weakness in that is our ethnic groups are logically looking after their own interests. And that is why Rodney didn't talk about multiracialism. Rodney talked about non-racialism, right? Because he accepted that we were a multi-ethnic society, a multiracial society. But he argued that what we needed was a non-racial praxis in which each group recognizes the importance of the particular place of the different ethnic groups. So if we were to strengthen the stock of African Guyanese, strengthen the stock of East Indian Guyanese, strengthen the stock of our indigenous, then we will be strengthening the collective, because each of them would bring to bear on the national canvas their own demands. And I think the more we demand for Guyana, the less we would have to give up to foreign nationals and foreign corporations. So I think we have to use our advocacy to advocate at two levels: advocate at the level of the individual groups, and marry that advocacy with advocacy, as Vincent would say, as a plural community, and bring that pressure to bear on the state so that we can stand up to foreign domination. I think we have to, however, conceive of this struggle against foreign capital in new ways. We are 60 years into independence. It is not that we have failed at what we have done, but I think we have to recognize new forces. They're all forces, but they're lining up in a new way. And we have to find new ways of combating old struggles. Hence, my suggestion that we do not leave the question of ethnic identity and ethnic strengthening out of the mix of things. I think in the first 60 years of independence, we erred on the side of the nation. One people, one nation, one destiny, which in a sense, for some people, opportunistically became doctrine rather than aspiration. And I think we now have to move to that aspirational level, strengthening our stance so that that can be the defense against imposition of foreign nationals who've come, but barraging at our door again.
I want to ask this question, favorite state. in Andrew's presentation, the question of the community, within the community. When one talks about development, there are essentially three approaches. There is the grid-pole approach, which is the one currently to a large extent being adopted again, where you create infrastructure, and those who have resources take advantage of infrastructure to get involved in it. Community approach, where you create an environment for development and economic activity at the community level, and the approach of the state itself, taking on the role through central planning. And what we've seen specific to the oil and gas industry, whilst we may not have had the technology to do the exploration and even exploitation of the gas, we have not seen the state recognize that a lot could be done to encourage local industry, using even the crops, to provide services to the oil and gas industry, which services are significant in terms of
Yes.
economic wealth that's involved. So if the state was to, rather than get involved in what you call the content and the all sorts of facades take place, essentially one class of people collude with the foreigners who provide the services. If the state had said, look, these services here, we are going to help to be the to assist the growth of local entities to provide those services, be they food, be they technological services, etc. Then we will be addressing the question of the growth of not only the economy, but the individual Guyanese through those entrepreneurial activities. So I think that's a big area that's a concern. And secondly, there's a question which we have referred to, consciousness. People's consciousness itself will really respond to circumstances which is
Mr. Benjamin, how do the racial divisions and tensions among workers documented by Rodney between 1881 to 1905 continue to influence workplace relations, politics, and social cohesion in contemporary?
To answer the question, I think I think it's in a nutshell, because here's the evidence that working class, and more specifically, Afro-Guyanese working class were introduced into a society as a system that wasn't designed for them to advance or for them to gain equal status in any other group. And that what he is being showed or attempted to do in his writing was to show that at some point, even the people who were working together to concerted energy, collective action was able to at least gain a point themselves and take a stand in each other in this community. Now that might be applicable to the period which is right, which is the 1940s to the 40s. But when we look at the landscape today, we still working class that is divided in many ways. Some of which are actually deliberate actions of the state operating in an environment which as more like economic talk or development, development as defined as economic growth or new economic growth, which is actually vision by the state, and not necessarily development that anything. So in a system like that, working class essentially production. And that we need to retreat from that thinking, and if you notice most of the literature that we deal with that, it's there's a requirement that comes out. What I would say is an alternative view of development, or an alternative view of development, and how we achieve that development. For me, there are a number of things that could be considered going forward. One of which as much as my two colleagues before spoke a lot about empowerment and economic African economic development. I think we cannot see economic divorce from representation and having political thoughts, having participation, for example, in the political decision making. And I think one of the most vital things that I haven't discussed in the other is, for example, how do we reform our political system that gives representation, including the smallest, the part, the working class society. For example, currently our political system basically have 2 or 3 political parties that dominate the political space. One of those political parties represents, we could argue back and forth, but we find we need greater representation, we need more voice. I haven't heard much discussion talking about constitutional reform, especially people, for example, or hearing after elections and the issues that I think could get achieving some of the very things that, for example, and presentation.
Thank you very much.
It was not only when we talk that in fact it covers not in the covers what just been said. And then we thought should so that I agree with Alvin that says the fact that any reference to institutional issues is a reference to what he has said. But in addition to that, consciously not honest, also very critical. Why I say that? In the end, nobody talks. Nobody speaks about development. And they cannot speak about development. Because speaking about development, you have to use the different yardsticks to determine if it's happening. Development is not determined mainly by economic growth. Economic growth is a base of which may develop. The development speaks essentially to the quality of life, access to education, access to health services, mortality rates, birth rates, overall quality of life, because the quality of life gets better. Then it means that you have both an individual and an aggregate change, qualitative change taking place. That's development. We do not speak about development together. And the articulation in the budget and all of those programs do not speak to development. It speaks to further economic growth and infrastructural. Then they use the word development, but that is not in the sense of human development. That's the sense of physical development. No, there are criticisms. And so, come back to the point. Physical to the guidance is a consciousness which allows him or her to understand that what is confidence is not the economic growth that is skewed, therefore probably perpetuates underdevelopment. So the thing of Rodney talks about.
Yeah, I don't think that it's a really following up on since bench in terms of this concept in structural expansion as a form of development. The contemporary literature actually has moved away from that type of discourse and sees what is happening here as a matter of infrastructural or physical expansion, and does not necessarily label it as development, because what in fact we're doing is creating greater physical access in terms of the number of roads and bridges and all of these things you have. So it's infrastructural expansion, but really in the literature of today, contextualize alongside the notion of development, because indeed development is qualitative, growth is quantitative. But I want to also follow up on a point that Wade raised in his comments. He talks about democracy in parts, and I think this is where improvement talks about consociational democracy, or engendering a radical democracy, new democracy, a democracy in which there is space for every group at the table. And therefore, you're moving away from the construct of the winner-take-all system. That is what Walter Rodney did not speak about it in that way, but he envisaged national unity government in which all of the groups that have representation have a say in matters of the state. The 1980 Constitution talks about the evolution of political power. In the post-2001 Constitution, in addressing the whole local government reform coming out of the post-2001 Constitution, makes provision for broader participation at the political level, in which you can have individuals contesting political office at the local level. Unfortunately, we are still stuck in this construct of the political parties competing for all the space. And so this is what will require to change that. Is that, look, you have provision in the Constitution that enable broader local participation, but you're still not getting that. We're still seeing a significant reliance on the participation of political parties and their nominees. What will change that is a change in what Improvement talks about consciousness, right? And so we have to ensure that there is a level of historical and contemporary political education that allows people to recognize that they have a responsibility to identify not just with that responsibility, but also with the opportunity to lead and to serve. And I think if we have that level of conscientization at the local level, that is really an opportunity for us to test and then to synergize at the higher levels.
And emphasizing the word conscious from this perspective. There's a lot of no-constitution. If understood in that means there's nothing constitution. It's ultimately that. There's a lot in it, not observed, and in fact, push back against. Let me give you a simple example. Our constitution has provided for local democracy And we have had even changes in our local government laws that give certain amount of autonomy to local authorities. The local authorities themselves seem not to understand that they have that autonomy, not insist on the exercise of that autonomy, and is pushed back by the autocratic state that does not allow the constitution to function and for the autonomy to be realized. So I think consciousness and conscious struggle is a very critical part of what's required. It has a lot to do not just with legal change and constitutional reform, it has to do with impacting our political culture which is very autocratic, very monolithic, and which is at the core of the problem. But let me go on to say that in the context of all of that, like we said, there is a class element of work in all of that. And that class element, incidentally, has a high coincidence with this. So that we have to discuss not only the question of ethnicity and race, have to discuss the question of class, because significant ethnographic element of class which makes our society, in many regards, a race-dominating society.
Dwayne? Other Mr. Alexander.
I did, Mr. Alexander,
Answer.
not answer directly, but he said a lot that I could work with. But the truth of the matter also, like saying that when we have kids, we could talk about class, we could talk about the ethnic and then there's a problem and all. Actually, we speak, we shouldn't speak, it's not good, we shouldn't speak the states. And I think a lot of this responsibility really lies with the state, but what kind of state will you want?
The state class dominated.
Well, the state is class dominated, the state is also functional related to
That's what it's taking care of.
I, right, then, that's why I'm not afraid, and I can want to say work.
Yeah.
But the question, how do we get this state? What can we? This is right. I think taking place at the grassroots, that's really bad. That have our unions, our workers represented, our grassroots represented, but we have to get them to start with this fucking way, because main change start from the bottom. So that kind of change that. So you could sit here and talk about the state, but how do we get the state if different question we have? So in what bodies like the back, like we have to take it to the ground into
Everybody gives me it's true the kind is it's true the kind is
Thank you.
Rodney is unique in that he married his activism to his academic. That his academic work was always designed for a political activism. He's writing that book when he's in the middle of this project of non-racialism, creating a non-racial society that eventually would fashion a non-racial state, right? And he is using his research and academic work to show that that non-racial reality that he's talking about could occur. It occurred between 1881 and 1905. So there's a political objective to that work written at that time. It is to show the correlation between the ethnic solidarity of that time and the ethnic solidarity project that Rodney was undertaking on the streets of Guyana. And so therefore that should not be lost in the analysis of the history of the Guyanese working people, because there was a shift in the radical thought at that time from working class to working people, and from working class to working classes. Because given the way in which our political economy developed, we felt that at that time we could no longer talk about a monolithic single working class. All right. So the political objective of Rodney's history of the Guyanese working people was to show that it is possible in Guyana to create a non-racial society, and arising out of that, a non-racial state that could come to the consociational arrangement that Nkrumah has spoken about.
Now, this is a very interesting debate. Being racial is natural.
Yes.
Apart from it being racial, if you're not going to change that, in my humble, it's not easy to change being racial. Like my little friend told me when he said I was born out of the homes of an Indian woman, I grew up in an Indian household, I live in an Indian community, and I ain't gonna have to make a decision. I can be influenced by that affinity. It's not that I don't like anybody else, but my natural being carrying me towards my fellow Indian. Therefore, the question of a non-racial state has a lot to do with governance. Governance, rather than transformation of the individual person or people nation. Nation is natural. So, issue we are confronted is one of governance. Because it's my own contention, I think I tried to make it in this little writing years, no match over it, that in the instances where we've seen racial solidarity, we've seen that racial solidarity because of a coincidental interest vis-a-vis the regime in power. So you get racial solidarity. But if there isn't that coincidental interest, then you have ethnic solidarity. And the problem persists unless you have the kind of governance that speaks to transparency, which most people don't understand what it means, accountability, ethics, and things like this. In fashioning society in such a way as to create an environment for equality, bearing in mind that since in some societies some groups are behind, then even as you do that, you have to have equitable arrangements for equalization.
Guyana has a little known article called Meeting and Parting. And I think in his own way he was extending Rodney's argument and reflecting what you explained there. That he explained that the two groups in our history, in particular the two groups, East Indian Guyanese and African Guyanese, there are moments when they meet and moments when they part. And I think in a sense, it was an extension of Rodney's argument. And Rodney was a concretist, and we will never know what he would have said and written if he were alive. So I just want to say that I'm not here saying that Rodney would have said this and all that. But Rodney was the kind of concretist who would, 20 years later, 30 years later, would have seen the insufficiency of his argument in the late 1970s, in the late 1990s, and would have sought to update the arguments. And like I said, he was writing that book at a particular juncture. He wanted it to serve a particular purpose. But the concretist in him, I'm arguing that 20 or 30 years later, he would have updated the thesis of the history of the Guyanese working people.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I really like that observation because, you know, sometimes we talk about this, the use of these constructs that lack indigenous relevance and meaning in this improved talk about this issue. in his discussion about consciousness. So if we may talk about in talking about the working class, you speak as though as if it is monolithic. But here you have you also have the working poor, right?
Yes.
You also have the underclass, those who are in the epitome of deep struggle. And so we have to understand the relevance of the particular time and context, right? Improve emphasize that. I think if you look at feminist standpoint theory, there is also some kind of kinship in the thinkings and writings of Nkrumah, Rodney, and others. You know, feminist standpoint theory argues, for example, that women as a group have been marginalized.
Yes.
But it is improper and unreasonable to speak monolithically about women's marginalization. Because the marginalization that a white, even though all women have been marginalized, the marginalization that a white woman experiences as against a woman of color is different. And so in order to understand, we have to disaggregate. And this is where knowledge becomes particularistic in the conversation that is intended to generate the level of consciousness that is required to promote and indulge, inculcate and institutionalize change that is relevant.
Thank you very much, Mr. D. Brother Dave has a question. Brother Dave, please go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah, I want to thank the panel. You guys are bringing forward some very good information. One thing I'd like to encourage the group is to try to get more participation in this type of forum because it is so important for our culture to have our people hear this kind of information and benefit from it. And I think with the kind of panel that we have and the kind of information that is being disseminated, there should be a lot more people either participating or asking more questions and also benefiting from this knowledge. So just a comment there. And then other my question to you guys is you brought forward quite a bit of knowledge based on some serious authors, French Fanon, Dr. Rodney, and I think these authors have several principles that they have outlaid in their presentations, and I think what would be valid is to hear from you guys as to what are some of the key principles that they have been talking about that you would think would be easily applied to Guyana, especially in the type of culture we have. It's not a strictly African culture. It's a multicultural society. So how could we bring these principles into the society and incorporate them into sort of the structure socially and in the sort of government type of situation?
Thank you very much, Brother Dave.
Person is which I think is something that we discuss in one of the
Well, on the development certainly, and the question of from Franz Fanon standpoint, the constancy of Fanon's argument about the vulnerability of those who are subjected to the kind of oppression, that the question of the consciousness is always going to be a problem. So on the development, the question of group consciousness within the context of well, Fanon was in Algeria, not necessarily the kind of plural society like Guyana, although there's some plurality there. And it is how we are able to use Fanon's thesis of group consciousness as a form of national cohesion and as a form of development, because I think what we've been trying to do here is to link consciousness with development. And in many regards, the International Decade of the People of African Descent forces us into that terrain. And the question of indigenous knowledge and indigenous knowledge formation guiding the process of development. And I think our independence leaders were acutely aware of that problem. As I argued before, I don't think they had the space to really apply it at the level of the state. Burnham was accused of racializing the state in favor of Africans. A dispassionate analysis would show that not to be true. The irony is that those who made that critique are today engaged in a very obscene racialization of the state, which is putting a brake on development, so that we have growth, but that growth is not translating into development because there's not an indigenous intervention, because these problems of development are rooted in slavery, are rooted in colonialism. And unless the state intentionally, as the United Nations is asking us to do, intentionally intervene, we are not going to deal with this problem. The state has to say that poverty is an issue, and we must intentionally intervene. And once you get into that corner of poverty, you will see that poverty is uneven. Poverty is egregious, but given the nature of our society, it's uneven. And so it will force us to grapple with the question of the unevenness in the society, both at the level of race and class. But as Brother Vincent has said, the intersection of race and class in Guyana is something that we often don't talk about to our parents. So I think the key issues of development and non-development, the issue of group consciousness, the issue of how do you use academic work to serve the process of national resistance and national development. I think that is key coming out of all of this.
Yes.
Because the three authors that we dealt with were serious academics, but they were activists. And so therefore putting their academic work to the service of the nation and the state. I would say those are the key takeaways from our series.
I want to make 2 points. One, safely responding. It is true that Fanon activism or the groups manifests. But Fanon himself always made the point that he was informed in what he invented by his Martinic origin, which is French colonial. The second point, I think, the second thing I want to say, I don't want us to go away from this concept. People not understanding the difference between liberation and independence. We haven't mentioned that, I think it's important. I argued on the liberation that naturally are tried. The racist, however, is when you adopt a position that you are superior to others. And so you can have racism manifest. You can have a state where the government, the regime, is ethnically or racially dominant. It takes up the position that they are superior to others. And therefore they have a right to make decisions and they have a right to privileges that others do not, as opposed to being racial. And so it's racism can be manifested in an individual who behaves towards another race as if he or she is superior. And I think that is highly manifest a lot in there. Highly manifest. And it takes on political connotations. So you hear things like when there's a change of government, they can't manage anything, don't know to manage. It's suggesting that we are superior to them in management. That is racist. That is racist. Right? And I think we are tremendously affected by that racism. To the extent that it is manifest in our governance. Point where people they want to improve state government is itself racist.
Thank you, Bert. As we bring this lecture series to a close, we want to extend heartfelt thank you to our presenters, Mr. Vincent Alexander, Dr. David Hines, Mr. Dwayne Benjamin, and Mr. Andrew Hicks for sharing their insights, and to you, our audience, for your engagement and thoughtful participation. And want to thank you again. Enjoy.
We want to thank you, Sister Kitty, for moderating this time, because your courage, I think, is very important in bringing out some of the key points that we want to bring out. And as the only female at the table, we want to politically sensitive, as the only female, you have a great burden of representing gender participation. So I wish to thank you on behalf of the panel for your insightful and skillful moderation. It's not easy when you're talking to people who have been involved with politics. We talk too much sometimes,
Yes.
right? I don't know what failure.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
And I think we must also acknowledge our technique.